It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who I will introduce a little bit more formally as we go forward. But we have Chris Lamb, cybersecurity researcher and energy security researcher at Sandia's National Labs. Let me find the correct button here. There we go. Before we get to Chris, I'll announce what's coming up in the next 2 weeks. For next week, we have Daniel Rosler, founder and CIO of Utility API. We'll talk about utility data and connectivity. So they're a company that houses data on utility energy usage and allows the companies to optimize their operations with those data. March 4th, we will have a discussion about energy databases, energy and exergy. If you wanted to learn what exergy is, 2 weeks from now is your chance. From colleagues of mine, Matthew Hune from Calvin University and Paul Brockway from the University of Leeds. So they will discuss a database about energy. And if you use energy data and want to understand the different metrics of energy, then this is your session not to be missed. Today, again, we have Chris Lamb, cybersecurity researcher and energy security researcher from Sandia National Lab. A little bit of the background of Chris here. He serves as a cybersecurity research scientist at Sandia. He's also a research assistant professor affiliated with the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at the University of New Mexico. His current research interests center around industrial control system cybersecurity, particularly in reference to nuclear and solar power, using machine learning, artificial intelligence, and their intersections. He has extensive experience designing and developing mission-critical distributed systems for a wide range of government departments and agencies. Skip to a little at the bottom. He has a BS in mechanical engineering. Go for mechanical engineering people. From Mexico State, an MS in computer science from the University of New Mexico, and a PhD in computer engineering from University of New Mexico. Maybe he will explain this last bit to us. He is a TOGAF9 certified enterprise architect and a GIAC certified exploit researcher and advanced penetration tester, and a GIAC certified penetration tester. So we can understand what these kind of testers and certifications are. His talk today promises to be quite interesting, short abstract, nice and short and sweet. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure are more common than ever. With increasing digitalization of critical infrastructure, this target will continue to become more important as we move into the future. Today's talk, Chris will discuss recent cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, how they were executed, how you can think about them, and why these techniques are going to be even more widely exploited in the future. So with that said, I'm going to hand over the screen to Chris. And as always, submit your questions in Zoom at any time via the question and answer feature. And if you are on YouTube, I will be looking at YouTube to check your questions there as well. With that said, Chris, floor is yours.
Okay, everyone. Hi, how are you? I'm glad to be here today. I know I feel kind of bad that picture. I feel like it's a really out of date dating profile. I was younger and had a lot less hair then. But at any rate, oh, I see you have a dating profile pic as well, Carrie. So nicely done. I appreciate that. So basically, I have spent my career doing research into AI and cybersecurity, and I've got an extensive background in kind of penetration testing cybersecurity, how you find and develop exploits, vulnerabilities, that kind of thing. And at Sandia, my day job, my hobby is being an assistant professor, in fact. But during my day job, I work with a variety of different kinds of generation systems primarily, some transmission, no real distribution. But I do look at solar inverters, distributed energy resources, large battery systems, as well as nuclear power and nuclear control systems. So that's kind of my background. And today, what I wanted to talk a little bit about is kind of why we're seeing more of this kind of cyber warfare thing happening today compared to what we saw maybe 10 years ago. And that it's at this point going to be fairly common, and there's some significant reasons for that, right? Why it differs from, say, kinetic things that nation states may do. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about some case studies of some intrusions into some industrial systems, how they actually were executed by the attackers, what they did, Then we'll talk about how you can look at these kinds of attacks and why it's important to have a framework in which to kind of categorize these things. And then we'll touch on why these things are going to be more popular and why it's so hard to figure out who actually does what these days. So to go ahead and get started, let's start with the Black Energy campaign in the Ukraine in 2016. This was an attack on energy generation systems in Ukraine, and it was first executed with an attacker sending an infected doc file to someone on a business network. Now, that person on the business network, as people always seem to do, I mean, honestly, whenever you do this kind of thing, there's always someone that's going to open one of these things. So if you just send it to a few people, you're guaranteed it seems to get in. Somebody opened it, and when they did, it executed a payload and started attacking neighboring systems. Now, it wasn't able to compromise all of the systems, but it was able to compromise enough. And that's pretty typical, right? Sometimes things won't be at the same patch level. They won't be running the same kind of application software. And so you can't compromise everything. But if you can compromise some things, that's usually sufficient. So once that document was opened, it infected the system that person was using. And then it pivoted to other systems that were nearby and infected those as well. It then established a communication channel to the attacker. The attacker was then able to, from the business network, extend through a virtual private network that had been established between the business network and the actual industrial control systems that were monitoring energy distribution. They were then able to compromise systems on the distribution network by sending a poisoned firmware image and uploading that poisoned firmware image to various analog to digital converters within this distribution system. Once that was done, they had compromised essentially everything that they needed to do. The distribution systems had been locked down. They had access through the VPN. They got access through the VPN because someone on the business network had a spreadsheet in which they saved all of the credentials required to get into the VPN and the VPN systems. So once they had this in play, they sat here in this distribution system, the business network, they just sat there for 6 months before they did anything. Then they sent the payload through the business network, again through the VPN, and into the distribution system. They also, just to be mean, brought down the call center. Now, Black Energy initially, before it was changed to compromise systems in this way, was a distributed denial of service tool. They used that functionality that was already resident in Black Energy to be able to attack the call center. And they brought the call center down. So as you'd expect, if people were having problems getting power at their home, they would call the call center just like we would call P&M and let them know that we've got an outage, right? Well, they couldn't get through. They couldn't tell anyone. Then they brought down the distribution network. They took all of the analog to digital converters with the poisoned firmware. They triggered a payload within that poisoned firmware to essentially overwrite everything within those analog to digital converters, causing those analog to digital converters to essentially be bricked. You know, at that point, they were just pieces of metal. They couldn't be fixed because they couldn't upload new firmware unless you have to go through some pretty extensive things like replacing EEPROMs in order to fix this kind of thing, which people just aren't going to do. So at the end of this, they were able to bring down power distribution throughout most of Ukraine and bring down the call center so it couldn't be reported. Pretty successful attack overall. But I think one thing to note in that attack, right, there was no real permanent damage. I mean, the analog to digital converters had been destroyed, but that's not that expensive to repair, right? And so they were able to, over time, bring things back up. You know, getting firmware that's been poisoned in some way or malware out of these large systems is hard, right? Once you've had a system compromised, you don't know how long it's been compromised, for example. In this case, it was 6 months. It could be longer, could be less. You don't know when you first make these discoveries. You don't know if every backup you've created is, in fact, already been corrupted with the malware that you're trying to eradicate. You don't know how far you can go back or how far you have to go back to find images that you can actually use. This is a significant problem, right? When you're talking about trying to recover systems, because you don't necessarily know where everything is, where all the malware is, where there might be additional things that could be triggered in the future. And so you end up in a position where you're having to essentially rebuild lots of infrastructure that you would not normally have to worry about. Now, that infrastructure isn't destroyed, but you're having to go through and actually rebuild it. So it's quite expensive to recover. Now, that said, let's look at an example in Germany in 2014 where we did have significant physical damage. Now, this was an industrial blast furnace in Eastern Germany. It was attacked. The people that attacked this particular industrial installation, we're not really sure who they were even today. But they were able to attack the system again by sending an attachment that had some kind of malware embedded. That was opened. It attacked neighboring systems, trying to pivot so it had additional footholds that it could use to attack other systems. Established communication channels back to the attacker. At that point, the business network had been compromised again. We're not sure in this example how exactly it got to plant SCADA. Now, there's a lot of ways that this kind of thing can happen. I'm assuming that everyone knows what SCADA stands for. Essentially, they're the supervisory control systems that you see in these kinds of large-scale installations that help you manage this kind of physical plant, essentially. We don't know how they got to the plant SCADA systems here. A really common way that this kind of thing is done is by infecting updates that are delivered to, say, the software in some way. I think most of you are probably familiar with Stuxnet, or you've heard that term. Stuxnet used that exact same vector to be able to get to centrifuges in Iran. They essentially were able to upload a library file that had been corrupted to inject code into any software that had been delivered from a workstation via a laptop that you would download it to bring it to a centrifuge to update. They were able to essentially insert malicious commands into the programs that were actually moved over to the centrifuges by using corrupted DLLs that already had those commands embedded. So they would just inject it into whatever you were programming, right? This is a pretty common approach, because people will usually have a workstation where you need to be able to maintain industrial equipment inside of your facility. So you'll have a workstation that you'll download updates to on the internet or on a business network or something like that. And then you'll take it offline off of that network. You'll move it over into the plant area. You'll attach it via perhaps a USB cable and reprogram that plant equipment. Very common vector. That's probably what happened in this case. So when you do that, you can tell that you can still have command and control, right? But it's not going to be real time by any means, because you're dependent on that laptop moving from one network where you can actually communicate with it through a business network, for example, to the plant network. But nevertheless, you're still able to compromise things, even though you may have latency that you really wouldn't have otherwise. In this particular example, then, there was essentially a trigger that was sent into the business network and into the plant SCADA network. When that malware was triggered at that point, it brought down plant SCADA and destroyed the blast furnace. It completely destroyed the blast furnace. That entire plant was essentially destroyed, and they weren't able to rebuild it. They simply had to build a new one. There was too much damage that had been done, and the internals of the plant had been destroyed. It was a pretty significant loss. So you can see in both of these examples, the first two, you can actually affect physical processes via malware in these ways, via industrial control systems, right? Because that's what industrial control systems do. They're just computer systems that allow you to manage and maintain things that actually exist in the real world, right? As opposed to things like credit card numbers and emails, which certainly very annoying, but you're not actually damaging things in the environment. That's the kind of thing you can start to do with these cyber physical systems that you can't otherwise do today. So the last example, we've looked at two where we've kind of gone through real physical damage to systems. This last one is a typical exercise that you'll see countries take when they're trying to exfiltrate information. They're trying to just gather information, do reconnaissance. Really, it's kind of an espionage function. Now, what I'd like you to notice is in all of these cases, the initial attack and the initial strategies are the same. They're attacking an individual system, usually via some kind of an attachment. That attachment contains malware, downloads malware in some way, and then that malware will pivot to attack other systems in the vicinity so they can start to kind of propagate. We call that moving horizontally through a network. In this particular example, we had the same kind of thing happen. We were able to get into a business network, and from there we were able to get into other networks that had some kind of peering arrangement or trust relationship with the initial network that had been attacked. And then you're able to compromise essentially the entire communications and business infrastructure of these companies. In this particular example, this happened at the DNC. I think one of the I'm not entirely sure who originally received the first email, but it was someone significant in the DNC at this time, and they were able to compromise all of these systems with that one intrusion and extract things like email, files, documents, spreadsheets, all kinds of things. This is a really common thing that you see at espionage people do today. You also will see, as you've seen, various organizations try to do physical things, but that's obviously a much more sensitive operation, right? We see a lot of this kind of data exfiltration activity today. We see, in some cases, areas where they've actually attacked physical systems like we've gone through, but it's much less common so far. So we've gone through these examples. We've seen that there's certain commonalities between how people try to attack systems, right? And that's important to note, and once you start to kind of understand how those attacks happen, you can start to kind of put a model around them and abstract how these things happen to kind of give you a framework to think about how systems are attacked and how you can disrupt those attacks potentially, right? So really what we're trying to understand more clearly is what attackers do, that's common. If there's a pattern, which we've already identified that there is one, and would kind of like to have some idea of how much it costs, right? Because if we can actually put in various kinds of controls to force people to repeat very expensive operations, that makes it less attractive for them to perhaps hit targets we don't want them to attack, right? So there are common things. We've already seen that. Specifically, they like to first get some kind of an access. They like to be able to look around and understand what happens in these systems. They like to be able to have some time to understand specifically what systems do what systems might be better targets, and really how they need to customize malware to compromise those particular targets. They want to be able to get control of as strategic of systems as they can, so they can completely, essentially start to control that infrastructure in ways that are important to them, depending on, of course, on what their targets are. And they want to be able to have some kind of action on target. They want to be able to either extract something of value that they can resell. We see that kind of thing in ransomware attacks all the time, especially today, because they're typically double ransomware attacks, where not only are organizations told that they need to provide some kind of money in order to be able to get their systems back online, but also if they don't pay, they'll have sensitive information released to people they don't necessarily want sensitive information released to, right? So we kind of looked at this a while back as a community, and we developed something called the cyber kill chain. Now, there's other models people can use to kind of frame this particular problem at different levels, I would say, of granularity, right? MITRE has their attack framework, which is very useful, but it's really at a much lower level than this, because the MITRE attack framework talks specifically about things people do, things attackers do, techniques that they use to compromise systems. So when you're looking at where that particularly fits, you're usually going to see that, in the things that attackers are doing on site: reconnaissance, exploitation, delivery, that kind of thing. This is a higher level framework that kind of tries to capture the kinds of things that you're typically going to see attackers do in almost any kind of engagement. Now, keep in mind, these various stages that we go through, when you look at the kill chain, even though they're shown here in kind of a serial, kind of waterfall-esque format, that's not how they're typically executed, right? Because what will happen is you'll compromise a facility or a network or a system, and you'll look around, you'll try to understand what's there, to collect information in order to understand what you need to weaponize in order to start to attack that system, right? Or spread yourself, get more access than you currently do. Excuse me. And so you'll go through this through, say, exploitation or installation, and then you'll go to another area that might be new, right? And then you'll go back to the beginning and start executing reconnaissance there. You can also execute reconnaissance externally, right? So the point that I'm making here is this looks like a waterfall process. It's not. It's very iterative depending on where you are attacking a given kind of enterprise. So this model, it was developed at Lockheed Martin Hutchinson, Clopert, and Amin actually put it together, I think, about a decade ago now. It's proven to be very useful. And being able to kind of frame our thinking in this kind of way in certain areas has been really great for us to be able to understand how we can start to counteract these kinds of attacks a little more in a little more targeted way, right? So let's start with reconnaissance and talk a little bit about what people do specifically there. So once we actually get into a system, say we have a payload that we email someone and they're at home and they open their email and they open the document. And so now we've been able to actually infect that laptop in some way, okay? And perhaps we have some kind of command and control on that too. So we've gone through this reconnaissance phase where we've targeted this laptop, we've developed a common exploit against that laptop, we've delivered it, we've exploited the laptop, we've installed malware, and now we've established command and control on that laptop, right? So we've been able to go through this entire chain on a particular laptop, but when that's actually moved into someone's place of business, we really have to start over. So when we first compromise a system, we need to learn everything we can about that system, its patch levels, how it's actually used when it's inside of an enterprise environment, the systems that it has access to, that it can get line of sight on, that it can see, that it can actually communicate with. These are the kinds of things you want to know because that allows you to understand what kind of access you can get with that initial foothold, right? This will take significant time, because you're talking about trying to target an organization. You need to understand who's in the organization. You try to understand who you need to send these emails to, what kind of emails they may actually open, what kind of documents they may open. These are very targeted spear phishing attacks, in fact. And so you want to be able to send them emails that look very convincing with documents that they're very motivated to read, in order to get them to open them so you can actually start to, say, infect their system in some way. Now, there's other ways you can attack systems too, of course. You don't always need to use spear phishing approaches, right? You can just try to attack a system externally, attack exposed services if there's bugs available there that you can exploit. That's typically harder. Those kind of remote code execution exploits are very difficult to find. They're expensive and they're more difficult to do than this kind of thing. Spear phishing just works. So you see just about everyone do it. So this kind of initial step can take a low level of effort over a long period of time. And you can have, say, on the order of 5 people working on this at any given time, trying to understand what targets that you're interested in might be exploitable or vulnerable to things you can do. So then you move into weaponization. So we've done requirements. We need to start to think about how we can continue the attack against these systems. So we need to further compromise systems, gain persistence on those systems, and acquire valuable information as much as we can. Now, when I say gain persistence, there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. People tend to think of persistence as, say, attacking some kind of computer system and then being able to use all kinds of nifty tricks to hide various malware hooks on that system. So in case, say, antivirus does remove the infection that you initially infected that system with, you will have other things that can still compromise that system at some later date. Now, that's one way you can do it. That's just kind of a host-based systemic way to look at the particular problem. Another way people will do this is simply use widely distributed memory resident malware across a large number of systems. Why does that work? Well, in those cases, that's dependent on you not turning off the power to everything at the same time. And honestly, that almost never happens. If you look at any kind of an environment, an enterprise, a power plant, a company, whatever you're looking at, the odds of all of those systems being turned off at any given point in time is essentially 0. So if you are able to gain residence in that enterprise with memory resident software, and by memory resident, it doesn't have any persistence on disk at all. So if you turn that system off, it's gone. But as long as that memory resident malware exists on another system and is able to reinfect, you still have control, right? So there's all kinds of ways that you can look at gaining persistence on these kinds of systems long term. This will usually take months to a year. You're, again, looking at about 5 FTEs for this kind of work. So once we've done reconnaissance, we've looked at how we can weaponize the things that we actually have control over. We need to think about how we can deliver a package that's going to actually start to spread a compromise, or is a package that we really want to have executed, right? Now, remember, there was multiple payloads that were used in the first 2 cases specifically. We had a payload that was contained inside of a Word document or a PDF file that initially gave us access. And then that initial malware would go back and it would actually download additional malware images to further the attack, right? Those downloaders would then use that new code to be able to attack very particular specific targets with, say, a firmware update, right? So these kind of delivery schemes can be pretty complex depending on what people are trying to do. The initial malware will usually be focused on trying to gather information. It may have some additional payload logic in it, but usually you're trying to understand what your environment is. So you can put together later stages that actually are more targeted towards what you really want to do to that target, right? So we deliver the payload. We've developed an exploit. We can further our compromise, and we need to deliver it to systems where it'll be invoked in some way. Okay, and once we've been able to do that, we can move on to exploitation. This step, months to a year, about 2 FTEs to work on this kind of thing. So when you start looking at exploitation, you need to get the exploit executed in some way. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we've looked at doing that, right? Typically, we just ask people to do it for us, and they will. And it's a very effective way to do it. There's other ways you can do it too. You can actually use various tools in the computer system that will essentially schedule execution of code for later. Windows, Linux, they all have various kinds of schedulers. In Linux, it's called a cron, basically, is the service name. On Windows systems, you have the scheduler and at commands that will, well, at commands also run on Linux or on Unixes. So there's a variety of ways you can do this. So if you're able to get some kind of command line access, you can just say, okay, I've downloaded a binary image. It'll execute. It's an executable file. Or maybe it's a library that you're going to actually load into another small program like DLL run on Windows, for example, to run that logic. And you schedule it to run, and that'll work just fine. So there's all kinds of different ways you can go about getting your exploit executed, right? Not just asking people to do it, but asking people to do it is a remarkably successful way to go about doing it. This will typically take months to a year, depending on how lucky you are, and it'll take about 2 people to do it. So we've kind of gone through this phase where we've looked around, we've downloaded potentially some code, we've understood what we needed to weaponize, we've delivered it to a system, we've exploited a vulnerability, so we now have some kind of command over that system. We usually want to install some kind of malware, some kind of persistent package. Now, not always, right? I mean, memory resident malware will not typically do this. It will just inject code into an already running process and allow that code to run inside of that process in some way. But you do typically need to get something installed that will allow you to run more complex code, right? As opposed to the initial code that you use to be able just initially to exploit the system. After you've got that in place, which will take months to a year, about 5 FTEs, you're looking at establishing robust command and control. So this is important because you typically don't know exactly what exists in an organization's infrastructure that you're trying to compromise if you're an attacker. You may have some idea of how to get in, but once you get in, you need to be able to still extract information on what's actually inside of those systems, right? And that's what command and control allows you to do. It allows you to get information to allow you to go back and start the process over, for example, at weaponization, putting together new kinds of malware packages that you can then download, install, and run. So it's bidirectional. You want to be able to execute commands on your malware installations to do particular things, maybe extract information, maybe execute some kind of a payload. You want to be able to pull information back. You want to really have complete bidirectional communication to allow you to execute certain things and to understand if that kind of execution is successful, right? And there's all kinds of ways that people will go about doing this too. I mean, people will tend to think that, well, you know, I mean, it's just like, say, an HTTP socket. So I'm communicating over HTTP with a high numbered port on a particular computer, and I'm just passing information that way. Yes, you can do that too. People use domain name services to pass information. People have used emails, shared Gmail accounts, where you can actually create drafts of email messages, and those drafts are not saved by the email provider typically. Gmail used to not save drafts. So it gave you a way to be able to essentially have a shared whiteboard that you could use to exchange information that wasn't saved in any way by the actual host, right? So there's all kinds of different ways you can do command and control here. And of course, you can do it without having a network connection by just using a computer that's going between networks, like we talked about in some of our first examples. So this can take months to a year to set up. Usually, when you have it set up, you want to keep it running for a period of time. It requires some investment to have servers that are able to do that kind of communication. There's ways that you need to be able to obfuscate that communication so it's not easily traceable. It's not necessarily trivial to be able to put this kind of thing together once you have it in place. So you want to be able to reuse it as much as you can. So again, you're looking at months to a year, about 5 people working on this kind of thing. Action on target, that's completely based on, what you're trying to do in a given campaign. It could be you're trying to extract emails. It could be that you want to blow up a blast furnace. It could be that you want to turn off the power. It could be that you just want to be able to install malware on various medical equipments inside of a hospital so you can actually execute a ransomware campaign. All kinds of things you can do that people would want to do in this kind of area. But eventually, once you have everything set up, your systems are infected, you've got robust command and control, you want to do something. So months to a year, about 5 FTEs. So we have some idea of how much it costs now to do this kind of thing, right? We've got about 25 engineers total working on this kind of stuff. It doesn't count support staff. I mean, these are actual engineers. You're going to have administrative staff. You're going to have janitorial, custodial, that kind of thing. So if you look at, 200K per year per engineer, that's an annual engineering budget of about 5 million per year, right? And if you put additional funding on that for facilities and other staff, say 25 million a year, that's pretty reasonable for this kind of work. So how does that stack up to other kinds of things that people would use, for example, that nations would use to attack other nations in times of conflict, right? Well, if you look at, say, aircraft, F-35 Lightning II, it's about $100 million, $180 million per unit, right? So pretty expensive, a lot more than 25 million. What about the Global Hawk? What about using various kinds of drones? Now, there's drones and then there's drones, right? It's been fascinating to see how drones have been used in, say, Ukraine over the past few years. That is an entirely new way to use that kind of technology in a very tactical sense. In the past, we have used tactical drones, the United States particularly, not necessarily in that way. People started using them like that in Iraq, but that just grew as we've seen. But if we look at the kinds of ways that we would say, launch, say, a missile or something like that, you could look at the Global Hawk. That's about $132 million per unit. So less expensive than a plane, still not cheap. How about a tank? If we want to just really be blatant and obvious with something that we're trying to destroy. $6 million per unit. Oh, well, that's cool. I mean, that's a little less expensive than the $25 million we're using to run this particular organization, right? What about cruise missiles? They're a big favorite, I think, of the United States particularly. They run about $1.6 million per unit. So you could certainly use cruise missiles to take off power infrastructure. We've seen a lot of that kind of thing happening over the past few years in the Russo-Ukraine conflict. So, we're getting to a price point that's a little more reasonable than, say, the 25 million to do the kinds of things we're trying to do with just bad software, right? The problem is, though, attribution is really clear with all of this stuff. If you can see a Global Hawk, you know who it came from. If you can see a tank, you know who built it. So you know who's attacking you. There's no deniability, no plausible deniability at all in those cases, right? Now, when you're looking at people using software to be able to attack these kinds of systems, that's not necessarily the case, right? So, I mean, this is just a binary image in a hex editor. And this is an executable. It does some evil stuff, right? You can see that at least. But who wrote this? You have no idea who wrote this. You don't even know where it came from. Someone could have uploaded it from a USB drive. Somebody could have downloaded it from an email message. You just have no idea. So how about this? This is another perspective onto the same program we were looking at just a bit earlier. This is disassembly. This is assembly code that's out of that particular program that allows you to understand how it's executing. Now, You can see a few things here. You're starting to get some information, but it's really hard to understand necessarily who might have built this. You can see things like stack check guard. Well, if you know anything about compilers, you know that that's actually generated by the compiler, so it has no real bearing on who created this software. You see unpack library, you see handle error. Now, unpack library is interesting. That may be something that someone's actually using as a function call in this particular program, right? So you can get some information there. This may be actually written initially by an English speaker. You don't know. So let's take another look at another perspective of this disassembly code. Okay, so this is essentially decompiled code. Okay, so we've gone from binary code to disassembled code to decompiled code. Now, even when you're decompiling libraries, it's still really hard to understand necessarily what's going on. But you can see some things here that are useful, right? So we can see load packed, unpack library. We can see these function calls. The function calls are in English. That may not matter, right? It's hard to really tell if that's something that's important for us. We're trying to do attribution over this particular piece of software. But what might be really important is things like error opening library file or writing library file or closing library file, right? Those are interesting things to look at because those look like real error messages created by the developer of this piece of malware. And that would lead you to believe that perhaps the developer actually spoke English as a native language. I mean, maybe not, though. You never really know. English is a really common language, so it could be someone who's just comfortable in it, or they could be doing it on purpose to try to make it look like it's someone else, right? So what other things do we look for? Well, when we look at trying to get attribution off of the malware image, you can see when things are built by looking at timestamps on the image sometimes. That information can be removed. Sometimes it's not. So that gives you an idea of the business hours that people may have been working during to develop this. Now, surprisingly, when you look at nation states doing this kind of thing, usually folks are working a 9 to 5. And so you can see when they were working based on Greenwich Mean Time to give you an idea of potentially where they might have been working to develop the malware you're looking at. Things like variables, comments, messages. We looked at some messages in that malware image, right, where we were looking particularly at given strings, and they were in English. That might be a good thing to notice. Keyboard symbols. Many programming languages now actually support emojis. Are there emojis inside of the program? If so, what are they? Are there other kinds of symbols? Are there, say, Cyrillic alphabet? Something like that. Does that exist there? Maybe, maybe not. Libraries, common code. Typically, if you have a single organization building a variety of malware packages, they will reuse strategic pieces of code to make it easier and faster for them to develop any kind of malware they're working on. So that gives you the ability to perhaps chain a group of malware samples together. So if you can get attribution on a single one of those, you're suddenly able to get attribution all across all of those different images that you could see were related. What kind of domains are being used for command and control? Where are those domains hosted? Sometimes that's key information. Frequently, you will see people mention in various kinds of social venues things that they've worked on or things that they've done. There's an entire black and gray market that people that develop and sell malware use to do this. And there's social media there, just like there is in kind of the day-to-day computing environments that we all use and see. And so if you have access to that, you can sometimes see people talking about things that they've done and how they've done it. And that gives you important information to be able to take that back and perhaps do attribution over a group of exploits or malware. But at the end of the day, attribution of malware images that attack physical systems is hard. It's much harder than doing attribution over a tank you can see. It's very difficult to do it. At the end of the day, though, what we do know is that this kind of approach, using malware to attack physical systems, especially critical ones like power infrastructure, it's effective. It works if people aren't paying attention. It's relatively inexpensive, certainly less expensive than various kinds of weapon systems. It's very difficult to trace. Attribution is very difficult to do, as we kind of saw just a second ago. It's something you can do today. It's a usable tactic. It's a usable strategy. And so I think moving forward, we're just going to see more of this kind of thing happening. And interestingly, there's a lot of this going on between the Ukraine and Russia that we never hear about. It's constantly happening over there. So they have to deal with cyber attacks on an ongoing basis, as well as physical attacks and kinetic attacks. And so it's a very challenging and unique environment today. So that's really my talk for today. And so with that said, I'd like to open the floor to questions.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. We have a few questions popping up here. I guess one of my takeaways is if I want to become a Bond villain hacker, I need $25 million. Just gotta create a startup fund for that. Let's see, we're roughly in energy. Oh no, stop sharing your screen here. I don't know, you might stop sharing just so we can see your face bigger on the screen.
Yeah, sure.
Here's a question. Are there, it's just a question, we're energy speaker series. So are there any serious cyber attacks on energy companies in the recent time? I can't remember how many years ago it was about this, the Continental Pipeline. It was a gasoline.
Yeah, it's still
pipeline.
happening. It's still happening.
Still happening. Yeah, go ahead.
What we see a lot of is business network compromise. A lot of that doesn't necessarily get into kind of more sensitive networks where you see a lot of the industrial control systems. We've seen those kinds of attacks against nuclear power plants, most recently in India. The Colonial Pipeline one is a very interesting example because a lot of people don't realize how interconnected a lot of these energy systems are. And the pipeline issue was very interesting to me because they never actually compromised any of the industrial control systems on that pipeline. They were able to compromise the billing system. And the billing system is what they used to essentially determine when they were shipping fuel to various customers. So if the billing system was down, they didn't have a way to tell customers when to take fuel and how much fuel to take out of the pipeline. And so they had to shut it down. And they had to have it down for 3 days because they had an accounting system that was easily accessible, that was in fact critically trusted by their critical infrastructure. So this kind of thing is common because people don't necessarily think about these kinds of trust relationships and how important they are, especially in areas that are considered to be not high risk, like a pipeline. You see people doing renewable work not really paying that much attention to that as well. Again, if you've got 50 wind turbines, if one goes down, it's not necessarily a big deal. If you've got 100,000 inverters in a small metro grid, if 100 of those go down, it doesn't matter. It's not great for the customers, but it doesn't make a difference to you. But there are times when you can have these small systems that you think don't matter. They can actually have a much larger effect that you just really weren't aware of because you didn't understand how your system was operating today and what systems were trusted inappropriately.
Right. So your answer there kind of makes me think, or I'm going to ask you to kind of elaborate here a little bit on essentially your premise earlier. You kind of pointed out someone might infiltrate a system, and this case of the pipeline was just a billing system, and they really want that functional to be able to make the pipeline function, which is different than breaking the pipeline or trying to damage a pump or something like this. And you're talking about physical infrastructure damage. For people who aren't engineers maybe listening, can you kind of just describe how control of a SCADA system or a control and data acquisition system of a power plant or a factory or what have you can actually cause physical damage? Like, what they're controlling something and then something goes awry and there's an explosion or something mechanically breaks. Can you just give a few examples?
Sure. Well, the classic example people will look at is either pressure buildup without appropriate physical safety backups, or excessive temperature. That's what actually took down the blast furnace. They ran it too hot deliberately, and the blast furnace basically went unoperational.
And in that case, just let me clarify, is that the case where the people operating the plant, the system's been compromised, so they think it's operating fine, but the attacker knows it's not operating fine? Is that
the attacker basically turned off the ability to be able to, in that particular example, to be able to control the system at all? They took control of it and then detached it from essentially the control room. But you would not typically see that happen in, say, a nuclear power plant with a very large safety culture. Industrial systems like blast furnaces, there's still safety culture there, certainly. But, it's possible for these kinds of things to happen if you don't have appropriate redundancy in place. Typically, things that we'll look at is if you can get control of, say, a couple of actuators, can you overpressurize a pipe system in some way? So you can blow out a pipe in some way. So you can create real physical damage that takes significant time to repair. The blast furnace example is great because it destroyed basically the entire plant. Usually, you don't see damage that's that extensive. You will sometimes see damage where you'll have people just brick certain devices to require manual intervention. That's a much more common technique because typically people are building systems that have appropriate physical safety backup. So if you do have a situation where you are overpressurizing a pipe, there's some kind of a relief valve that will automatically trigger to stop that from necessarily rupturing that pipe, right? So I hope that answers your question. I feel like I was starting to dance around stuff at the end there.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I know as myself and others that work here at the university, I'm probably less so than at Sandia. Here's the question on from a viewer. Obviously, we're not expert in everything. How can we protect ourselves from these kinds of threats, from emails to emojis and pictures? So I know I go through my little minor training, which has got to be some level less detailed than what you go through. But what are the, I don't know, it's kind of bread and butter of preventing yourself from being exploited.
So there's all kinds of technical ways you can do it. I mean, every organization has administrative controls. You kind of mentioned going through training to try to stop people from opening documents or spreadsheets or whatnot. And the fact is, it doesn't work very well. It's getting harder and harder to be able to tell if you're sent an email that email is not something you should pay attention to. And many organizations have their organizational hierarchy accessible externally. So I understand who runs a company. I know what their names are. If I can in some way forge their email address, I mean, we're all being told things like, look at links, see if the links make sense, see if things are spelled correctly, see who it's from. Those kinds of things can typically be forged. It takes more effort, but you can do things like domain. Well, it's a technique called domain shadowing, or I might have a Google link, or say I host something on Amazon S3, which is just a storage service that Amazon runs, and that then has a file that I open that forwards me to another site that you can't see the URL of. So you see the URL and it says aws.amazon.com and some stuff. And you think, oh, okay, that's fine. I mean, I've seen that kind of thing before. And so you open it and it goes to what I've set up at Amazon, and then it will actually redirect that request to a URL that I control and download malware. Other ways you can put in bad email information, for example. It's harder to do this today, but people used to run what they would call open email relays, open SMTP relays that you could attach to, and you could forge all that stuff. You could forge the to field, the reply fields, all of that to make it whatever you wanted it to be. And so you would receive that email that would perhaps have an attachment that I had attached that was malicious, and it would look like it was from your boss, and it would be referencing that particular document, and you'd open it because people almost always do. And so some of the training we do isn't that effective. If you couple that with various administrative or various technical controls, for example, where you actually look at downloading suspicious attachments into a sandbox, and then you open them to try to detonate a malware payload if it exists, okay? That's a common thing that's done today. The problem with that, right, is you cannot do that in a way that, well, typically organizations won't do that in a way that will hold up email for a significant period of time. So you will typically download the attachment, detonate it, send the email, and then if you see that detonation actually caused something bad to happen, you would then, turn off your computer essentially, or cut off access to it, to the network, and then send someone to clean it up. So there's those kinds of things that people do as well, technically, to try to stop these things from happening. Yeah.
Okay.
There's other ones too, but anyway.
Right. Is there much known? This is kind of me just making up a question here. On the different types of actors for cyber attacks. So we have the state actors, government type entities. You mentioned maybe you're in a hot war or not already. You mentioned Ukraine and Russia. Maybe people that just want money and they're just like, maybe this is a way to earn money. what else is there? Is there evidence or things or companies or hacking other companies to steal secrets or something? Or is it just kind of state actors and money, people looking for money, I don't know, robbing?
Well, there's a large financial motive. Ideological motives are big, as well as the one you didn't really touch on, but those are big as well. Um, yes, there's definitely industrial espionage going on, but you have to also keep in mind that different countries have different perspectives with respect to the separation of government from private entities. Typically in the West, we've separated those very cleanly. Other countries don't. So you have more interchange between, say, state services that might be trying to acquire data that they can then give to private firms to develop technology based on what they've been able to acquire. So you certainly see that kind of thing happening.
Right. Thinking from an energy kind of perspective, and I often think, yeah, what is an energy piece of infrastructure? It's something that, is a physical thing. It extracts a resource flow or a stock or something from the environment. So it's got this, physical component. It's a drilling rig, it's a solar panel, as you say. It's
Safety systems.
yeah, and certainly the electric grid hardware. So are there examples or more insight you can give into the hardware design, I guess you might say, that can prevent, or the kinds of things that are done to prevent software exploitation? You mentioned a relief valve on a pressure vessel. That's kind of a nice, simple example. I don't know how much more complicated it gets than that.
You know, so that example it was pretty simple, but you'll notice also that there's a separation between the organizations or the people that would have to implement those controls, right? Typically, the people that are building out the piping that would put in that kind of a safety valve aren't the people that are putting in the SCADA and ICS systems. So you need to have significant cross-organizational communication to be able to understand that, hey, that is a risk, but it's being taken care of because we've got this physical safety device in place. There's lots of technical things that people do to try to make it harder to develop malware. And you see a lot of those kinds of things in commercial computing systems. In fact, in the code that we were looking at, you saw a function called stack check fail. I think it was stack check fail. But that is a way that people now check to see if people are trying to exploit what they call the execution stack within a program, right? Where you overflow the data that might be being used in memory with certain types of information to allow you to get control of what we call the instruction pointer, which is the point in memory at which that computer is actually executing commands, right? That is a technical control to try to prevent that kind of thing from happening. There's other things that you'll see people doing as well today. When you look specifically at ICS systems, safety systems are a great example of this kind of thing. The TriConnect safety systems are heavily internally redundant. They have separate execution environments on separate processors, which make them very resilient and very robust and very difficult to be able to attack. But they have been attacked. And the malware strain was Triton, and it was, in fact, written in Python, which was interesting, or at least the samples that we have had Python code and some binary information. And in order for that to be able to work, there had to be a physical setting on the device in a particular way to allow crosstalk between the various execution domains, and that device was in that state. So some of those were just deliberately turned off, which kind of begs the next question where you ask, well, how common is that kind of thing? Where you're seeing kind of hybrid attacks where you have a physical component and a cyber component. And that kind of attack strategy is something we are concerned about, of using essentially cyber activity to be able to make physical intrusion, for example, easier. Because if you look at physical intrusion detection and prevention systems, they're heavily digitized as well. So they're vulnerable just like these kinds of control systems are today. So in fact, I'm sure that the UT Austin campus has a fairly robust building automation system that's managed from a centralized location. And all of those systems are digitized ICS systems that do things like turn on your heat, turn on your air conditioning, control, say, ventilation hoods in areas where you may be doing chemical work, all kinds of things of that nature. Perhaps doing things with water flow throughout the campus. Like in Albuquerque, where I live, all of our water has to flow uphill so we can actually drink it, right? So We essentially have a large pumping system that moves it to the top part of the city. If we turn off those pumps in some way, suddenly 2 days later, Albuquerque has no water. So, these kinds of digital systems are everywhere, and there's all kinds of ways that we can try to prevent this kind of thing from happening, but they're almost always all circumventable, or there's another way that you can actually achieve your goals that's related.
Excuse me. Yeah. So maybe we'll end on this one. This is a question here, which is kind of you kind of say how pervasive how pervasive you can give more feedback on that, but that cyber attacks or attempted cyber attacks might become more pervasive going forward for the reasons you discussed about in terms of cost and hiding who you are as an attacker. So why don't, I'm just thinking myself, why don't I hear of something going bad every day, of something getting hacked? Is it that it happens on small scale, and so this is just not something I'm going to hear in the news? Or there's like superheroes like you that, you just right before it happens, you found it and you save the day right before it happens, and you have to see the movie, but every day you're saving the world, and I just don't notice. How is
Well,
that
actually,
playing out?
you do see it happen all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, you're constantly hearing about ransomware attacks, or you used to. You don't hear about that so much because it just became old news. That's still going on. There's significant interplay between criminal organizations and national intelligence organizations, right? Intelligence services will develop new approaches and new malware, and they will give that to criminal organizations to facilitate access. Intelligence organizations and nation states typically are not interested in causing physical damage until there's fairly significant extenuating circumstances, right? Ideally, what you want to be able to do if you're a nation state is to be able to get access and just sit there and be undiscovered as long as you can. So if you need it, you can pull a trigger and have bad things happen. Ransomware actors don't care. They want to make money today. So you're constantly seeing them using these kinds of attacks against critical infrastructure like hospitals, for instance, and charging ransom for turning on life-saving equipment. That thing happens. We've actually had fatalities from ransomware attacks. Because we've had equipment turned off, we've had medical records inaccessible, that kind of thing. So this thing happens all the time. This kind of thing is happening all the time everywhere. It's just that, it's not getting reported, and the magnitude of these things isn't such that it's kind of hit a new level from what we've seen in the past couple of years so far. Is that going to happen at some time in the future? I mean, I fully believe that there are areas in our critical infrastructure that have been compromised and we don't know. I don't expect, if those things are triggered, it's not going to be any kind of a surprise to us. Let's just put it that way, because I don't think anyone's pushing that button unless there's pretty significant reasons to do so.
Yeah, I think you just answered my last follow-up question, which is there a public database or good tracking of this, how many attacks and the quantity of money? And I think you're kind of saying no, maybe because people don't want to admit it, or have various reasons for maybe not reporting, or maybe it's just
a lot of this stuff does get reported to the government. You're required legally to be able to report certain kinds of compromises. So that stuff is collected. Okay. It's just not really openly published.
Oh, right. Very well. All right. So somebody like you kind of has a good feel of what's going on. Somebody like me will not know, but somebody knows. All right. Very well. Well, Chris Lamb is somebody who knows how much cyber attacking is going on in the world. He's a cybersecurity researcher and researcher of energy security at Sandia National Labs. Thanks for joining us with the UT Energy Symposium.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It was great talking to you guys.